Hey everyone, this comes from a Genesis lecture I taught on how Cain repeats the story in Eden, specifically of Adam and Eve's rebellion. And it's a pattern in Genesis that is often overlooked. So let's jump right in. When we look at the Bible and we tend to break it up into, should I interpret this literally or should I interpret this metaphorically? That's like doing surgery with an axe. It misses the mark entirely. We categorize it that way in our modern minds because that's how we operate. But there's plenty of examples, and we'll see here shortly tonight, of how that's not how the original audience, or even in the time of Jesus' New Testament letters, that's not how it was perceived. But we're going to do all this again with the goal of navigating the opening pages of the Bible, these first 11 chapters, in the same way as the original audience. We're going to do our best to get back into their minds. So this is where we'll be tonight. Again, we're going to finish the entire narrative of Genesis chapter 2 through Genesis chapter 3:21. We'll look at the quote-unquote the first fall and also God's grace within that. And then we'll do the Cain and Abel story. And then also challenges and issues for modern thinking. We just covered that briefly. But just to recap last week, this is really where we stretched last week a little bit in our thinking, looking at Genesis chapter 1 account of creation and the Genesis chapter 2 account of creation, how there's really two main macro views, and there's several little deviations within each view. But there's one view that would say they are two separate accounts of creation, with really that Genesis chapter 2 verse 4 being a transition, and that Genesis chapter 1 is a cosmic overview, God and his cosmic temple, or there's other forms of it. And the second, and then Genesis chapter 2 focuses in on Eden specifically when God calls Adam and Eve. And the other view, which is this bottom view right here, is that Genesis chapter 2 is an elaboration of day 6. And we talked about some of the issues perhaps within that view. And this is a good illustration comparing Genesis chapter 1 account to Genesis chapter 2 account. How we see the length of time varies in each account. And Genesis chapter 1, there's the 7-day narrative. Genesis chapter 2 account, it says in the day. The order of creation in the first account is man and woman are created at the same time. In chapter 2, man was created first, then other creatures, and woman last. The material, we talked about the waters in Genesis chapter 1. If you recall back to week 1, those are the primordial chaos waters referenced there. And Genesis chapter 2, it's more of a dry desert region that doesn't have enough water. And from that, God essentially brings a garden forth. And then the method in Genesis 1, it's God's divine speech. And then in Genesis chapter 2, it's God actually forming like the clay and the potter. And then the status, very good in the first, and then the tree of knowledge and the tree of good and bad, or good and evil, are present. And then humanity's place in Genesis chapter 1, they're the apex of creation. They're the final act of creation. And then within the Genesis chapter 2 account, they're just among the created order. So it's just in the midst of everything else. And so that's a good overall view to recap from last week on how those two views, I guess, issues maybe with this first view right here of it being an elaboration, because there are some differences. But if we can look at it, and perhaps it's a transition into God creates cosmically, and then he focuses in on his own region, that Eden region, which we get to cover garden imagery tonight. So that's the big setup for this. But here's the full account. We stopped at this blue arrow last week. This is that second narrative of Genesis chapter 2. We have a stopping point at verse 25 in Genesis chapter 2. That's where we break modern up because of chapter breaks. And again, we covered the chapter breaks a little bit last week, but this is really the overall macro structure of the entire Genesis 2 account. You can see it actually runs through chapter 3. And there are some ancient texts that'll have a stopping point at verse 21. Others will have it at verse 24 within chapter 3. And I'll talk about why here in a little bit. It actually has to do with God's grace. But either way, you can see that there's structure here, which will break down this structure and why it's relevant to the conversation and how we interpret this account. Let's talk about gardens. And I love this picture because I think it's a beautiful picture. I stole it from Bible Project because they're an animation studio as well. But it's a picture of a garden coming out of the desert. And I think it's a great image of God planting that Eden, that paradise, in the middle of a dry, barren wasteland. And so garden imagery, as you can see here, it was the language of heaven and earth in the time of the Bible. And specifically across all cultures. When you talked about gardens, every king had a garden. The gods had a garden in every culture. And so gardens were very important to that time and that culture. And then God even talks about when the Israelites go into exile and the prophets come to them, the prophets such as Jeremiah, he actually tells them, while you are in captivity, plant gardens. And so plant those pictures of paradise that you've lost to remember what you are hoping for one day. This is a picture, really the biblical picture of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is where this is heaven and this is earth, and the Garden of Eden is where heaven meets earth. And so that's that paradise state is really that Edenic picture. Genesis is the introduction to garden imagery, but you see gardens all the way throughout the story, and ultimately in Revelation in the new heaven and new earth. Revelation chapter 22, if you read all 5 of these verses, it's just Eden imagery, but in the state of perfection in the new heaven and the new earth. Eden is on the first page, and it's on the last page. It's what humanity lost, and it's what we will ultimately get one day. And really, when we look at Eden, Eden is a reflection of the temple and tabernacle. If you see here in the middle, you've got the tree of life right here, the Garden of Eden. The garden is actually of Eden is in a land called Eden. And then there's that dry land outside where God created the humans. And then remember, we talked about last week how he placed the humans, how they took up residence within Eden. So there's that dry land outside. And then in regards to the temple and the tabernacle, you have the Holy of Holies, the holy place, the courtroom, and then the land of Israel and Jerusalem. So it's this picture of the actual land. So let's get into Genesis chapter 3. We'll look at really this overview of the first account. We'll look at the structure of it. And this is where we get introduced to the serpent. And when we talk about the serpent, the word for serpent is the Hebrew word nakash. And it has a triple meaning to it, just based on where it's used, the vowel markers, that kind of thing. But it can mean serpent. It can also mean copper. And it can also mean a diviner, someone that gives omens or divination. And so you can see that the numbers right here, just the breakdowns of how it's used throughout the Bible. But you can see in the garden, and I'm skipping ahead a little bit here just to show you how the nakash can mean more than just serpent. But it's when the serpent specifically talks to Eve. It says, "But the serpent said to the woman, 'You will not surely die.'" And this is something that scholars have recognized as an omen. And so when you talk about a diviner, someone that gives omens, that the serpent is actually essentially acting in that role as a diviner. And then what's really interesting is when you look at the punishment for the serpent in the story, is the punishment is, "On your belly you shall go," and snakes already crawl on their belly. So it's a weird, well, aren't you already on your belly? "Dust you shall eat," and snakes don't really eat dust. So that's something that probably shouldn't be taken literally. But this is more of language about being brought low to the ground. You're being brought low when you think of terms of raised up with God and then not with God, being brought low. And there's a correlation, again, to Isaiah. This word Hallel in Hebrew is this O'Day star from Isaiah, which many have interpreted to actually be a reference to Satan or the divine rebel from Genesis chapter 1. And this is what it says: "How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low." And so a lot of people have drawn a correlation to this character here and the snake from the garden. And basically the long and short of it is that rather than it being a snake in the garden or a serpent in the garden, that it was actually a divine being, a spiritual being that rebelled against God and came to Eve in the garden. And so that's one way it can be interpreted. Snakes are also, there's snake imagery all across the ancient Near Eastern cultures. So again, it's just another way to perhaps think about it and to stretch the mind as we read into these stories. But that is all we'll cover on the divine nature side of it. I want to focus in on the structure of the story and specifically how the snake interacts with both the man and the woman. And you can see here, this is evidence. This is where people are getting the continuation narrative, how chapter 3 is not really a stopping point. You can see this 25 right here is chapter 2, verse 25. And we looked at this last week where it talked about the man and his wife were both naked and were not ashamed. So there's no shame in the nakedness. And then you have this narrative between the snake and the woman. And this yellow just represents the snake speaking. And the green is either the woman speaking to the serpent or the woman seeing that the tree was good. He took her advice, if you will. So there's this pattern of snake says, woman says, snake says, and then woman acts upon what the snake had said. She saw that the tree was good. And then you can see here the correlating to the blue up here is that all of a sudden they knew they were naked and then they hid themselves. So now where there was no shame before, where they were not ashamed of their nakedness, now they are ashamed that they are naked and hid themselves. And this is obviously a result of eating from that tree of good and evil or good and bad. And this really, why I'm focusing in on this aspect of it, is because this is that hinge point when we look at the chiastic structure. And again, what chiastic structure means is simply you have a buildup to a climactic point in the story, and then the story reverses back on itself. And so you can see these patterns represent that. And basically the woman and the man taking and eating from the tree and then giving some, or the woman taking and eating and then giving some to her husband, is that hinge point of this entire narrative. And so it's what's known as the test. And what's interesting about this being the test is we looked in week 1 about how we looked at how days 1 and 2, 2 and 5, and 3 and 6 are correlated. And we looked specifically within day 3 and 6, how there's a bonus act of creation. And that in day 3, it was specifically honing in on the fruit trees, how those are likened to human beings on day 6. So you have this humans and trees being made similar, or the author wanting you to think in similar terms when you see the word human and you see the word tree. And so we talked as well about different instances where humans are correlated to trees, where this correlation is made. Again, Adam and Eve are in that story right now at the fall. There's Moses at the burning bush. And then all of these examples, the vine and the branches in the New Testament. And then also Jesus, the cross is actually referenced as a tree as well, where Jesus was hung and where he was killed. But the entire point of this is that trees are often used to illustrate a moment of decision and testing for humans, along with that being correlated to them. And then people, just like trees, become places of testing, which we will see in the Genesis 4 narrative. But in terms of this tree being a place of testing, the tree is where Adam and Eve are confronted. And it's the tree of knowledge and good and bad. And then again, there's this mysterious figure, this either whether it's a serpent, whether it's a divine being, convinces them that they're to eat this fruit. And this is what's interesting right here. And to what the serpent or this Nakash figure says to the woman is he says, you will surely not die. For God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be open and you will be like gods, knowing good and bad. So again, this establishes the theme right here of trees becoming the places of testing because they're at this tree. And the reason I have the word gods underlined there, to go back with the divine council class that we did in Sunday school, was that later on in the story, when God says they will be like us, knowing good if they take from the tree of life. And it's actually in verse 22 where Yahweh says, behold, the man has become like one of us. And so there's this belief, you'll see it translated in many Bibles as you will be like God. But if that were the case, you have to ask the question of, are they really going to be the status of Yahweh or just one of his spiritual residents and divine family members? So anyways, something fun to think about. But we talked about this chiastic structure. There is the man and the woman, they're created and they're unified. And then there's a dialogue between the snake and the woman. And I know that's hard to read, but that's what this section is right here. The reversal of those two in the chiastic structure is the dialogue between God and the humans. And then ultimately the consequences for all of the parties involved, namely the serpent, the woman, and the man. And what's interesting about that in terms of structure and how this text is written is that you actually have consequences handed out in this chapter in the order that the characters appear to quote unquote rebel. So it's first given to the snake. The snake is given his punishment. The woman is then given her punishment, and then the man is given his punishment. So we'll start with the snake. In verse 15, it says, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. This is the point in the story, when we look at the Bible as a whole, that the author is telling you to pay attention to genealogies. We've all had those moments where we come across a chapter of entire genealogies, and you're like, why is this in here? Well, spoiler alert, Genesis 5 is all genealogy, and Genesis 10 is all genealogy. But there's a purpose for that. This is where, and the reason I have the word seed in here is because the word literally is seed. You'll see offspring in many translations, but it's literally a seed. So think a tree has a seed, humans having seed. And so there's this correlation that they want you to pay attention to, that there's going to be essentially the woman's seed versus the seed of the divine rebel moving forward in the story. The woman is then next given her punishment, or not, I shouldn't say punishment. How about judgment? That's a better word for it. But this is what the Lord says to the woman. He says, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. And then your desire shall be contrary to your husband, but he shall rule over you. What's interesting, and the reason I have this word pain highlighted, is because the word pain can also mean anxiety in Hebrew, which, given the ancient context behind that, I should say, is that a woman's barrenness was viewed in ancient times as something that was very detrimental to her status in society. So I'm not telling you that it should be translated as anxiety. I'm telling you it could be. So it could be pain or anxiety, but this, either way, poses a really interesting question. And it's something we'll cover a little bit later on, because we've heard, at least there's in some views, that the world prior to Adam and Eve's sin at this tree was entirely perfect. If we've all heard there was no pain, there was no suffering prior to this. If this verse says, I will multiply your pain, that seems to indicate that there was some kind of pain or anxiety already present in the story. So again, we'll come back to that in a little bit, at least the theme of that. But the man's judgment comes next, and it says, because you listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten the tree which I commanded you, you shall not eat of it. Cursed is the ground because of you. In pain you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Again, that word pain is the same word of anxiety. But the reason I have that, I'll stop right here. I'm not trying to pick on the women here. I'm not trying to pick on the wives. The reason I have this underlined right here and making a point about it is because this phrase shows up in the story of Abraham and Sarah. When it says, remember the story of Abraham and Sarah is she can't have a child. That goes back to she thinks that she was barren, that status of society. So she says, hey, we got this slave in Egypt, sleep with her and your line can continue. We know the story where she gets really jealous of Hagar, the slave at that point. But the phrase used, this phrase, because you listen to the voice of your wife, and is the same phrasing in the Abraham and Sarah story when they decide to do things their own way. Hagar becomes a tree of testing and they fail the test. So there's this repeat pattern in it. And then in verse 18, and on that too, this goes back to that term that we looked at, the word for helper, or when God says, I will make a helper, when we talked about making Eve or making woman out of the side, and how that word actually doesn't mean assistant or anything like that. It's the indispensable other, without whom the desired good cannot happen. And it's because they are supposed to be a unit, if you will, that you can't have one without the other. If one functions bad, it causes the other to function bad as well and not walk out their purpose. And then going on to verse 18, it says, thorns and thistles, the ground, it shall bring for you, and you shall eat the plants of the field. By the sweat of your face, you shall eat bread. What's interesting about this, the ground becomes cursed. And ultimately, the humans go from being in a lush garden paradise where food is plentiful and always available to now having to labor and toil and eat the plants of the field that they labor over, rather than the food of the garden that God had provided for them. And so you see, this is more than just, hey, you're going to have to start farming in this case. This is ultimately you're going to be banished from the presence of God. And what's interesting here is transitioning on. It goes right from this verse 19 where it says, till you return from the ground, for out of it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. The very next line it says, the man called his wife's name Eve because she was the mother of all living. He just went through this terrible list of consequences. And then, oh, by the way, her name was Eve. That seems like almost an odd transition point, if you will. But what I'm getting at here is that you see this pattern, Eve and living. She's named Eve because she was the mother of the living. In Hebrew, it's a word play. Eve's name is the Hebrew word chava, and it literally means life or living. And so you see this name pattern. It's actually a continuation of the name pattern from Genesis chapter 1, but you see this naming pattern of someone being named that indicates, in this case, how Eve is correlated to living, how the words are correlated. You see that same naming and correlation pattern throughout the Bible. It actually starts in Genesis chapter 1 when God creates light, and he calls the light day. And then it continues on in the New Testament too, where in Matthew's gospel, it's talking about Mary. It says, she will bear a son, and you shall call his name, in Hebrew, Yeshua, for he will save his people from their sins. Yeshua in their language meant the Lord is my salvation or salvation. And so you see this naming play continue all throughout the story. This is not something just unique to this 11 chapters. Again, this is an introduction on how names and people are introduced. And finally, in verse 21 says, and the Lord made for Adam and for his wife garments of skins and clothed them. So remember how they tried to cover themselves with the figs of the tree because they were ashamed of their nakedness. God actually provides a sacrifice out of animal skins for them. And then again, many have pointed to, and I think rightly so, that this is a correlation between a sacrifice being made for the sin of people. But along with this is where some texts, and I believe it's the oldest manuscripts really available, they actually have a break in the section right here. In other words, this is where the narrative of all of Genesis chapter 2 and 3 would end right here. Now, Genesis chapter 3 goes on 4 more verses, but I think, and it ends with the humans being banished. But I think what's interesting is that the text ending here is that this section break, and it was meant to be, these are sections you read and then go back and digest. This section, if it ends here, would actually end with an act of grace from God after the humans fall. So you have this fall, these consequences, and then you have God's atoning, covering grace for them. Now, again, with this, just correlating this to what we'll see in chapter 4, this naming pattern, when Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another seed. There's that word seed again, instead of Abel, for Cain killed him. So Seth and appointed in Hebrew are actually related words. They sound very similar to one another. And also, here's the final 3 verses of chapter 3. This is when, again, the Lord says, behold, the man or the human has become like one of us. I say the human because that's that word ha-adam, where it's a prefix added to it, really just means humanity. But behold, the human has become like one of us, knowing good and bad. That's why I'd reference it's possibly you would be like gods. In other words, you would be like residents of the spiritual realm if you had eaten the fruit. And it continues, now lest he reach out and take his hand, and also take of the tree of life, and live forever. Therefore, the Lord God sent him out from the Garden of Eden to work the ground from which he was taken. He drove out the human, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the way to the tree of life. This is where the humans are banished from God's paradise in the story. And you can see they go east. They travel east. That's going to be important. But they go to work the ground from which they were taken. So if we look back to chapter 2, when the man was originally created out of the dust, really out of the dust and water, the clay, the mud mixture, God took him out of a barren wasteland, essentially, placed him in this lush garden. And because the humans decided to do it their own way, instead of doing it God's way, they decided to try and acquire knowledge of good and bad their own way. That's actually in biblical terms, that's how you would talk to a child. So it's implying that there's this childlike nature to Adam and Eve, but they return to that original ground, that barren wasteland. And then again, east of the garden. And the reason that this is important is, and this is, what is his name? It's a scholar, his name is Michael Morales. I don't know if he drew this picture, but this is a correlation that he's made, that when you look at Eden, and when you look at the tabernacle and the temple, you essentially have a mirror image of one another. And if you actually follow this, there's the center of the garden, the tree of life, and you can see coming east here, there's the cherubim that guard the way, and then it branches off. There's the 4 rivers that we covered. It's the same pattern going from the Holy of Holies all the way out. And you can see this actually, you move east out of the temple. So there's this narrative and there's this correlation they want you to draw that as you see the temple show up later in the story, it is a mirror image of Eden. And that's because the temple and the tabernacle were the place that God could come and dwell with his people. It's literally a temporary Eden. It's a traveling temporary Eden throughout the desert until they reach the promised land of Israel, where God establishes his temple. And then ultimately, he's going to come back and reclaim the earth. And then One last thing before we jump into Genesis chapter 4. Again, this is the theme we looked at a little bit ago, but this one line in chapter 22 right here. It's, now, lest he reach out his hand and take also the tree of life and eat and live forever. This seems to imply that humans would not have lived forever because they had to eat from the tree of life to do so, and God is preventing that. I grew up at least hearing that if Adam and Eve had never sinned, they'd still be alive. But this right here seems to imply that humans were not immortal leading up to this time. And so it doesn't really give us any more on that. I think this is really because we're asking questions that likely the ancient audience was not asking. And so with that, we'll transition to chapter 4. And we know this is the Cain and Abel story. And what's so interesting is now that we've looked at the pattern of Genesis chapter 2 and chapter 3, that one garden narrative, we're going to see a lot of similarities here in the Cain and Abel story. And this is the macro structure of Genesis chapter 4. Genesis chapter 4 is broken into two large sections. That's this gray area right here. And in the middle are three birth scenes. So three scenes of children being born. And they're depressing narrative because they both involve murder. And so there's the murder of Abel by Cain, and then there's one of Cain's descendants. And we'll compare the similarities there. But going on, this is the scholar Jordan Wenham. He noted this from chapter 4, that the term Abel and brother occurs 7 times, and the term Cain occurs 14 times. 14 just being instances of 7 that we looked at from Genesis chapter 1. There's that 7 theme coming back. And then the final verse of this chapter is at that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This is the 70th mention of God or the deity in Genesis and the 14th use of the key word call. So again, there's that 14 and 70 being, if 7 is complete, then 70 is the idea is it's 10 times the completeness. But this is how he sums it up. He says, in all these respects, chapter 4 is entirely typical of the editorial techniques used throughout Genesis, and its present form must owe much to the final editor. Now, this has to get into, what he's getting at here is authorship when it comes to the Bible, which is a fascinating topic, but it's interesting what he pointed out that this theme of 7 continues throughout. I just wanted you mainly to see the macro overview. So I'm going to sum up chapter 4, what happens, and then we'll look into some specifics of it right here. And here's the question that we can ask going into this. Where have I heard this story before? Now, we've only had 3 chapters up to this point, but as you'll see, it's this idea of this patterns throughout the Bible. So Cain's offering, you remember Cain and Abel both present an offering. Abel's is accepted, Cain's is rejected. And the Lord responds to him, if you do good, will you not be lifted up? And this is a reflection of chapter 3, or chapters 2 and 3, I should say, where there's a choice about doing good at the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And then the Lord tells Cain, sin is crouching at the door. So there's the temptation. And it matches the human temptation that Eve faced at that tree as well, to take and eat of the fruit. Cain murders Abel. He fails the test. And in that sense, Abel has become like a tree, a place of testing for his brother. So where Adam and Eve fell at the tree, at the literal tree in the garden, Cain now fails his test at Abel, but remember, humans and trees are likened together. So God shows up and asks the question. He says, where is your brother? Just like God appeared and asked the question to Adam and Eve, he said, where are you? And that's where they came out and they said, hey, we were hiding because we were naked and we were ashamed of that nakedness. And so you see this repeat of God showing up and asking a question. In both instances, they dodge the question. Cain responds with the famous line, am I my brother's keeper? Whereas both Adam and Eve responds by saying, the serpent tempted me, or the serpent pulled me in some way, shape, or form, and I did. And then Adam turns around and said, the woman you gave me made me do it. And so in all 3 instances, the human dodges the question. Going on in the Genesis chapter 4 narrative, a curse is placed on the ground because of what Cain did to his brother. It says, and now you are cursed from the ground. And in this story, the ground almost becomes like a character because it says the blood of your brother, or it's either the blood or the ground is crying up on behalf of your brother. And then just like in Genesis chapter 2 or chapter 3, in that narrative, there is a curse placed on the ground. This is what it says in verse 7 of chapter 4. It says, sin's desire is toward you, but you should rule over it. This is inverted from when God tells Eve, your desire shall be toward your husband, but he shall rule over you. It's the same Hebrew words used in both instances. So it's flipped. And then going on in the Cain and Abel story, the Lord tells Cain, he says, when you till the ground, no longer shall it yield its strength to you. And yes, there's a typo in there by me. My apologies. And in the Adam and Eve story, working the ground became more difficult as well. Then ultimately Cain is banished, which, interesting fact, he is banished to the east as well, just like Adam and Eve were banished to the east of the garden. And so you see this repeating theme where Cain's parents fail the test at the tree. And in the same, essentially 10 steps, Cain fails the exact same test again. And the result, the consequences are a little bit more. It's more than just you failed and you got banished. Again, like we saw with Adam and Eve, the punishment is Cain murders his brother, and he says to the Lord, my punishment is too harsh to bear. And the Lord essentially promises the person who harms you will be avenged 7 times. But Cain's son goes on to build a city, And it's a civilization, and it's the first city that's mentioned in the Bible. And cities don't do too well to begin in the Bible. They're this place of disorder and great evil stirs up. And then ultimately, and this is just so you can see the reversal kind of theme of this mini chiastic structure, is that Cain has a descendant, I believe it's his grandson, named Lamech. And Lamech's son, whose name is Tubal-Cain, has a civilization that invents weapons. And Lamech also is the second murder story in this as well. So you can see that Cain, the result of Cain's action murdering his brother, is a snowball effect for bad things happening throughout the rest of the narrative. And then also what was interesting, I can't remember the scholar, I don't have his name that wrote this, but he made reference to city building in the ancient Near East where this came from. City building was a divine enterprise. So where it was viewed as a divine enterprise, now in this story you have humans trying to step into that role. That was an interesting correlation. Now, where the stories are a little bit different when we look at this narrative of Genesis 4, where Cain murders and then also his descendant Lamech murders, Cain is actually sorrowful when it comes to his murder. He says, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden." We'll get into a little bit more on what he says next, but first I want to look at, just so that you can see the narrative structure of these two stories of murder happening, where Cain is sorrowful, his descendant Lamech is not. And this is what it says. Lamech said to his wives in verse 23, "Adah and Zillah, hear my voice, you wives of Lamech. Listen to what I say. I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. If Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold. So whereas God is the one who tells Cain that you will be avenged 7 times, in this narrative, Lamech takes it upon himself to basically say, if my ancestor was avenged 7 times, then I get 77 times that. So it's now a human trying to give himself his own blessing. And I just broke this down into color so that you can see this is actually a poem, not a great poem when you read the words of it. By any means, it's a boastful poem about murder, so that you can see the literary style. And when you come to passages when you're reading the Bible, you'll see the style occur quite frequently. But what's interesting about Lamech is that this is the instance where we see the perversion of the marriage institution. Lamech is the first person in the Bible to have 2 wives. If you remember back in Genesis chapter 1, that man and woman coming together, that was the perfect union, husband and wife. Lamech now has 2 wives. And then with these wives, Lamech has 3 sons. And each one of these sons, and I don't have the names up here, but each one of the 3 sons, they're titled the father of a cultural institution. And so the interest of the narrative is in the origins of human civilization and its diverse institutions. Again, we looked at his descendants being the ones that came up with this idea of weaponry, but that's what's going on at play here as well. And we talked about polemic a little bit last week. This would be considered polemic as well, because this account would have stood in contrast to Israel's surrounding neighbors and their accounts for the origins of animal husbandry, music, and metalworking. And those are the 3 institutions of Lamech's sons. And those institutions were all viewed as divine wisdom from the gods, whereas the gods and other stories had to give that knowledge to people. The biblical story is simply saying that these came from a man, where ultimately God is the only one who can actually give out. So it is a polemic narrative against the surrounding cultures. But again, just to recap here, this grand narrative is that at the beginning of this chapter 4, a child is named in relation to Yahweh. And then you have the murder narrative. Then a city is named in relation to humans, and that's the name going through Cain's line. And then Lamech, one of Cain's descendants, murders. But at the very end, you have something very interesting. It ends with the naming of another child in relation to God that results in true worship. So just how we looked at that act of grace from Genesis chapter 3, there's something else at play here too. And it's essentially because Abel was murdered. This is what verse 25 and verse 26 say. These are the final verses of the chapter. It says, "And Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son and called his name Seth. For she said, God has appointed for me another seed instead of Abel, for Cain killed him." So again, Seth and appointed are both correlating Hebrew words. They sound very similar to one another. And there's that seed talk going back to seed. Pay attention to the upcoming generations that you will see, because these generations are ultimately the story of God's people and where they come from. And then verse 26 says, "To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh." And then it ends with this phrase, "At that time, people began to call upon the name of the Lord." So where Abel is murdered and Cain essentially starts this horrible downfall because of him, of civilization turning and evil happening and more murder happening, and a replacement is given for Abel, who was murdered. And it is ultimately Seth who is the line where people began to call on the name of the Lord again. So you have this great redemptive act in the story again. But it's an invitation, because next week in chapter 5, we're going to look at the genealogy list, and that genealogy list in contrast to other seeds that are opposed to God. Hey guys, let me know what you thought in the comments below, and also be sure to like and subscribe. And if you enjoyed this video, you can check out this video that YouTube has picked out for you. And I will see you on the next one. Thank you all so much for the support.